Hi! On the Woodpecker today, I'm making a stand for my new bandsaw. My saw is finished, but having it on my workbench is less than ideal. So I'm going to build the base. The base will look a lot like my other shop cabinets. And just like my other shop furniture, I just drew the frame of the base. First things first, I need to prepare some maple. I almost have all the frame pieces, but I'm forced to glue those two together for one corner. When the glue is dry, I repeat just like the others. Now that I have all the pieces, I cut them to length. Now I have to mark and cut all the mortises. I begin with the two sides. I have some plywoods from an old dresser near my front door. I'm going to use them for the inside of the frames. But before that step, I need to cut the strips that are still glued onto it. And remove the old varnish. Then I cut a groove for this plywood. I move the rip fence and check the width with a test piece. It's a bit wide. I fix this and widen all the grooves. Before going any further, I sand the inside of the frames. Then I take care of the plywood. Next, I can finally glue both frames. Since the panels are made of plywood, I glue them inside the grooves. Okay, now I have to let the glue dry. When it's dry, I recut the top and bottom so everything is at the same level. Now I have to sand the saw marks inside the base. Then it's time to make the rest of the mortises. Before going on, I need to dry assemble the base. Then I can measure and cut the top central support. With this piece cut, I mark and cut its mortises. Then I have to cut those pieces also. The saw will be screwed onto them. And just like the central support, I mark some mortises positions. Then I cut more grooves for the back plywood. After measuring its size, I cut the back. Then I cut all the mortises and assemble both top and bottom frames. While the glue dries, I glue some dominoes into the mortises of both sides. This way, I won't need to bother doing it in the final glue-ups. When the glue is dry, I can glue all the pieces together. I leave this alone for the rest of the day. The next morning, I start to work on the top of the base. But I don't have a plywood big enough, so I'm going to cut this one in two. Now with these two pieces, I have enough. I just need to glue them together. So I mark and drill some mortises. Then I can glue both pieces together. While this dries, I can start on the central divider. I figure out what I need and cut it to length. Just like the rest of the base, I cut a groove for some plywood. Mortises, measure the size of the plywood and cut it. But this time the separator is made out of 3 pieces of plywood. The last thing to do is glue it. When the glue is dry, I can put it in place. But first, I need to mark the notches for the corners and cut them. Then I can glue it in place. I also need to glue a filler strip at the back of the separator. I want both sides to be separated from each other so the dust will stay on this side. But to clamp this, I have to be creative. A right angle on the back and a clamp inside the bench hole in the other. Now that the glue is dry, I can sand the top and cut it to the right dimensions. Okay, I have the top, but I still need to cut more maple for the edging. Then I make the first 45-degree cut and put it in place. Mark its length and cut it. Then comes the mortises. I temporarily place the first edge in place and repeat the same operations up until I have all the 4 edges done. When that's done, I glue them. When the glue is dry, I sand the top. Then, I route a round over on the edging. Next, I finish all the sanding. The base is now finished, so I need to transform this into drawers. I begin by removing all the varnish. When that's done, I rip each of them in half. Now I need to glue them all into flat panels. After a little while, I have enough panels to make my drawers. When the glue is dry, I sand them all so they're at the same thickness. So here are my drawers. Okay, not yet, but it's getting there. First, I need to cut all the wood for the big one and cut some dovetails. I begin by the pins. Then I turn the pattern around and cut the tails. After a dry fit, I see that it's perfect, but I have one hole. I fix that right away. One done, 2 more to go. But since the 2 others are more shallow, I rip the glue up in 2. But all the rest of the operations are the same. Now that I have all my drawers, I mark the bottom groove and cut it. And I can measure the bottoms and cut them. Before gluing them, I sand the inside. And finally, I glue all of them. It's done, but I also need some false fronts. So I begin by cutting some plywood. When I have 2 pieces that are the right size, I rip the left one in 2. Okay, I have all 3 fronts. Now I need to take care of their edges. The first thing to do is make some maple edging. Here they are. Now I have to route the mating shape into the plywood. And it's as simple as gluing all of this together. And this doesn't take too long, and all the drawers have a nice edging. The next day, the glue is dry and I can sand the edging to the plywood. But the edging adds a bit to the fronts. I have to cut them at the size of the original front. Now that I have everything for my drawers, I can give them their final sanding. So after a nice cleanup of the drawers and all the rest, I'm ready to apply some finish. But I have one small problem. The varnish I intend to use is a bit old and a little too thick, but I don't want to lose it. So I'll use it only where it will never show. And all the rest will be sprayed. When the finish is dry, I sand a little and apply a second coat. I do the same for the third coat. When it's dry, I can install the drawers. I'm just noticing that I have nothing to hold the second drawer slides. So I cut a scrap piece to the right width and glue it in place with epoxy. When the glue is dry, I can install the slides. And here they are, the 3 drawers in place. But to have a mobile base, I need to put some casters. All done. One thing I can say is that now it will be easy to move the saw around. Speaking of the saw, I need to put it on its new base. But this is way too heavy to just lay it down, so I need to remove a lot of things. Then with some help, we put it on the base. And with the saw in place, I can trace the shape of the dust hole. We put the saw on the floor and I drill a hole in each corner. Then I cut between the holes. After a light sanding, I can trace what I need to remove from the top frame. Now we can put the saw in place and screw it. In all, I use 6 screws. Then I can reassemble it. Now I'm ready for the false fronts, but it's only then that I notice that the carriage bolt is in the way. I remove the drawers and drill a bigger hole for the bolt's head. Okay, now I'm ready to install the false front. I begin by finding their center and drill a hole. Now with the thin spacer under the front, I'm able to mark the hole's position on the drawers and drill a small hole. Now with both holes, I screw the front in place from the outside. Then from the inside, I add 4 screws. I do the same thing for the rest of them. Now I need some drawer spools. I begin by cutting some pieces of sapele into an octagonal form. Put this on the lathe and turn some pulls. Here they are. I just need to put them in place. I begin by removing the central screw and drill a bigger hole into the drawers. This is as simple as screwing the pulls in place. With this last pull, I'm ready to put the saw in its place. First of all, we have to move my actual bandsaw elsewhere in the shop. Then I can push my brand new saw in place. And the last thing to do is to stick a plaque with a date on it. And here it is, my new saw on its base. This is how I made my bandsaw base, and I hope to see you soon on the Woodpecker.